Believe it or not, New York City landlords and tenants will be better off without rent control. So if the Supreme Court nixes the New York City rent control law, things will be better for everyone. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's an opinion piece about what exactly would happen if the Supreme Court decides, hey, we're going to toss out this rent control law in New York City, okay? Now, my hope is that the Supreme Court does take a look at this case, decides that the rent control law is unconstitutional, but it goes further than that, okay? I want to see all of the rent control laws throughout the entire country being judged as unconstitutional. And that's what this very case could do, okay? It can make it so that landlords throughout the entire country can finally raise their rents and not have to deal with government price controls. And you know what? That's a good thing. It's a good thing because it would open up the market to people who before they didn't want to invest or they didn't want to build new real estate developments because they couldn't make any money. They didn't want to do it because there was no money in it. And so, by them putting these laws in place, they actually were restricting the market and making it much, much more difficult to have affordable housing. Now, I know all the silly tenant rights people who don't understand the way a market works. They're going to be like, oh, but landlords, they're then going to raise the rent rates to levels that nobody will be able to afford. And I'm like, hey, that's impossible. Nobody is going to raise the rent to a level that no one can afford, because then our units would be sitting empty. Do you not understand how the free market works? We can only charge what people are willing to pay, okay? If there are no people who are willing to pay over a certain amount for rents, then guess what? That is the maximum that we can charge. And, if you don't understand that, then you don't understand anything about economics, and you need to just be quiet and let us handle it, okay? So yeah, it's a stupid argument when they're like, oh, the landlords are gonna like all of a sudden I could just say, oh yeah, you got to pay $100,000 a month, and then everyone would be homeless, nobody could afford the rents. No, it won't work that way. It will not work that way, even in New York. Instead, what you're going to see is that the market rates are going to be dictated by supply and demand, okay? And right now, because there's such a limited supply, yeah, there might be higher costs in the short term, but businesses will step in, okay? These companies, they're going to step in. They're going to be like, hey, there's profit to be made. We're going to start building more properties. We're going to increase the supply so that we can make more money. But when you increase the supply and the demand doesn't increase, well, guess what? Prices actually will get lower and things will get better for the tenants overall. But, we know all this, okay? We are business people, the kind of people who watch this channel, landlords. They understand the markets better than the tenants' rights advocates do. And, shouldn't be surprising to anybody. So, hopefully the Supreme Court takes this case up and things go our way. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Do you think the Supreme Court's going to take up the whole rent control issue? And if they do you think they're going to strike down rent control in New York or throughout the entire country? What do you think is going to happen? I'm just curious, I'm not that optimistic because, rent control has been in place for so long. But, funnier things have happened, okay? Anyway, let's get into this article. This article is coming from the NewYorkPost.com, and it says, if Supreme Court nixes New York City rent control, tenants and landlords will be better off. And yes, they would. So let's see what the author has to say. In a case that promises to utterly upend New York politics and boost the city's housing market, the Supreme Court may soon strike down the essence of the rent control laws. Local politicians love nothing more than to gesture on behalf of cheaper housing, as with the City Council bill aiming to force landlords to pay broker fees on rental units, or the drive for a state law that would, in the name of limiting evictions, make rent control statewide. This case could end the never-ending game by gutting the core rent law. In the process, it would end New York's eternal housing crisis practically overnight, benefiting both tenants and landlords. You know, it still wouldn't be able to, even if they said, okay, rent control is no longer in place, right? Well, that wouldn't end all of the eviction protections and all the other ridiculous laws and rules and regulations they've put in place. But it would be a good start, okay? It would be a good start, and it would enable landlords to at least be able to make enough, money so they can actually do repairs and keep their capital expenditures up to date, make updates to the properties, and then when they make those updates, be able to charge for those updates. So, like people, they wonder, why are properties in such disrepair in New York? Well, the rent control laws are the reason. In May, New York landlord groups asked the court to hear their challenge to the state rent stabilization law, which lets the city cap rent hikes and gives tenants a virtually ironclad right to renew their leases. It's led to some people renting the same unit for decades and then passing it to a family member, caretaker, or friend. In many cases, building owners never regain control over those units, even if they want them for their own families or other purposes. Yeah, so maybe it would actually help prevent, some of these tenants from being able to stay in their units for, just decades. And the fact that they can pass a tenancy on to your kids or friends, or sell tenancy to somebody, that is ridiculous, okay? That is absolutely wrong in every possible way. You should never be able to pass on your tenancy, so that your kids and your great grandkids and, on into eternity can have cheap rent. Talk about dumb, okay? Talk about communist, socialist garbage. And, I hope they throw that out. I hope they throw that out and those people get kicked to the curb. No, I do not have sympathy for them, because, the whole premise behind that is wrong. It's dead wrong, and it needs to be destroyed. And that, the suit contends, amounts to an unconstitutional taking of property in violation of the Fifth Amendment. For years, few would have imagined the law, which dates to 1969, could be overturned, even though it forces landlords alone to eat the cost for a public good, affordable housing, and essentially deprives them of their own property. The U.S. District Court and the Second Circuit Court of Appeals both dismissed the suit after it was filed in 2019. Yet the Supremes lately have stood up for property rights, backing owners with a 6-3 vote in several key cases. Yeah, and I agree. It's an unconstitutional taking of private property for public use without just compensation. Okay? When the city tells you that, one, you have to rent to these people, you cannot remove them, you cannot take this property and use it for any other purpose, they have a right to live there forever. Yet they also tell you, well, you have to give them this cheap rent that doesn't cover the cost of maintenance, which doesn't cover the cost of, your taxes, insurance, mortgage payments, etc. So, basically they're telling you that you have to be a subsidized housing provider whether you want to or not. That's wrong. Okay? That is an unconstitutional taking. You are doing the job of the government in that case. If the government wants to provide housing, they should provide housing, not force private property owners to do so. But that is what they are telling these property owners they have to do. Okay? Now, I know I don't live in New York, but I strongly oppose rent control because I see this sort of thing flowing into other places, including places where I live and I invest. And that's what I don't want to see happen. If the Supreme Court doesn't come out and say, hey, rent control is not constitutional, then you know what's going to happen? It might not be this year. It might not be next year. It might be 20, 30 years from now, right? They're going to slowly be passing these sort of laws everywhere, even in places that were traditionally landlord friendly, like, Nebraska or Missouri, where I live and invest. Okay. So that's why I want to see this sort of law overturned before it gets here. Okay. It's very, very important. In 2021, by 6-3, they struck down a decades old California law that forced farms to let union organizers on their land noting that private owners have a right to exclude people from their property. That, argue the New York plaintiffs, is a far less intrusive taking than New York telling a landlord he or she must offer lease renewal at a city-dictated rent. The rent stabilization law, they argue, has had a detrimental effect on owners and tenants alike and has been stifling New York City's housing market for more than half a century. They're right. The lucky tenants with great deals on their units, even those well off enough to afford to pay full rent, hang on to them forever, keeping them off the market for truly needy families. And that is another huge factor right there, okay? It's basically, you can hold on to these units forever. The people who truly need the properties, they can never have access to it because they're passing it on through the generations. And there are cases of people who are upper income, and I'm talking about people who make hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars a year, who are getting the benefit of rent controlled units. And these people, they don't need affordable housing. They can afford market rate rents, yet they are getting government subsidized or forced, actually landlord subsidized rental rates. Okay. That's how ridiculous the whole policy, the whole system is. If they were doing things correctly, they would have made it means tested to even be eligible. And there would have never been you get this permanently, you can pass this on to their children. But no, they really had greedy self-interest in mind. And that's why, these sort of socialist policies don't work. Okay, they only encourage people to cheat the system. They only encourage people to become lazy and complacent. And they discourage people from wanting to invest in the market and expand it. Why would you? There is no benefit at all for majority of people to build new properties that would be stuck under this rent control system. So yeah, let's hope the Supreme Court throws this garbage out. It needs to go. It needs to go. Nobody needs the rent control from the government. Instead, we need an open market that is dictated by supply and demand.